The first time I wasn't asked, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment that demanded attention. It was small, almost invisible, the kind of moment most people would miss if they weren't already paying close attention. I noticed it because I always noticed details. I had learned to read rooms long before words were spoken. That day, the room felt the same, yet something was different. Plans were being discussed casually, nothing urgent, nothing serious, just everyday decisions, schedules, arrangements, things that affected all of us. I listened, waiting for the natural pause where my opinion usually fit. It never came. They kept talking, comfortably, smoothly, as if the circle was already complete without me. At first, I told myself it was nothing. People forget sometimes. Conversations move fast. I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to appear sensitive or insecure over something so small, so I stayed quiet. That silence wasn't forced. It was chosen, carefully, politely, the way you choose not to correct someone when the cost of correction feels heavier than the mistake itself. I sat there, nodding occasionally, letting their words pass over me. On the outside, I looked calm, present, involved. But inside, something subtle shifted. Not pain, not anger, just awareness. I realized I was listening to a decision already forming, one that no longer required my input. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about disrespect. It was something quieter than that. They simply didn't think to ask, and that realization carries a different weight. I watched how comfortable everyone was. No tension, no hesitation. The ease of it all told me this wasn't a one-time oversight. It was a pattern quietly introducing itself. I thought back to how things used to be, how conversations would pause naturally, how my thoughts were once expected, even relied on, when my presence meant participation, not observation. Those memories didn't hurt, they explained. Because nothing had been taken suddenly, it had been drifting away, slowly, almost kindly, so gently that resistance felt unnecessary. I noticed how I adjusted my posture, how I leaned back slightly, how my voice remained unused. It was instinctive. When you sense your role changing, your body responds before your mind catches up. Still, no one noticed, and that, more than anything, confirmed what I was beginning to understand. Being excluded loudly creates conflict. Being excluded quietly creates clarity. I didn't feel erased, I felt repositioned. They weren't pushing me away, they were moving forward, and I was no longer part of the motion. The conversation ended, decisions were made, everyone seemed satisfied. Someone smiled at me casually, as if to acknowledge my presence without inviting my participation. I smiled back, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Something had changed, and pretending otherwise would have required more energy than I was willing to spend. When the room finally fell silent, I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't circle back with questions. I didn't ask for explanations. I already had one. Later that evening, I replayed the moment in my mind. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just carefully, like examining something fragile to understand its shape. I wasn't searching for fault. I wasn't building a case. I simply wanted to be honest with myself. This wasn't about that one conversation. It was about all the small moments before it, the gradual shift in tone, the way information started arriving after decisions were finalized, the gentle reassurances that sounded kind but felt conclusive. "You'll be fine with this. We already handled it. It's easier this way." None of those phrases were cruel. That's what made them powerful. People don't realize how much distance can hide inside polite language. I thought about how often I had chosen silence over discomfort, how many times I had stepped back to keep peace, how frequently I had adjusted myself to avoid being seen as difficult. I had done it willingly, lovingly, with intention. But accommodation, when repeated too often, teaches others what to expect and eventually what to exclude. That understanding didn't bring regret, it brought responsibility, not blame, awareness. I realized that I had been slowly training everyone around me to move without me, not because I lacked value, but because I had stopped asserting my presence. And yet, even with that awareness, I didn't feel the urge to correct anything, because by the time people stop asking, the decision has already matured. I asked myself a simple question. If I spoke now, what would change? The answer was honest. Nothing meaningful. They might listen, they might nod, they might even apologize, but the dynamic had already shifted, and forcing myself back into it would only create friction where acceptance now felt more dignified. So instead of reacting, I observed. I noticed how my energy felt lighter when I stopped anticipating inclusion, how freeing it was not to prepare opinions no one requested, how calm I felt when I stopped waiting for my turn to speak. That calm wasn't resignation, it was alignment. I wasn't losing my voice, I was choosing where to use it. The first time I wasn't asked became a marker, not of rejection, but of transition. I was moving from involvement to independence, from participation to perspective. And perspective, I learned, comes with its own kind of strength. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I didn't imagine different outcomes. I simply accepted what had revealed itself. Some changes announce themselves loudly, others arrive quietly and stay. I slept peacefully, not because nothing had happened, but because I finally understood what was happening, and understanding, even when it's quiet, has a way of settling the soul. It didn't happen all at once. Conversations don't disappear suddenly. They relocate, quietly, gradually, almost politely. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the way discussions seemed to start before I entered the room, the way topics changed when I sat down, the way important details surfaced later, casually, as if I had already been informed. I told myself people were busy, distracted. Life moves fast, and not every conversation can wait for everyone. That explanation felt reasonable, and I accepted it without resistance. But reason has a way of wearing thin when patterns repeat. I noticed how voices lowered when I approached, not out of secrecy, but habit, as if certain discussions had learned to exist without my presence, as if my arrival was an interruption rather than an inclusion. No one stopped talking completely, that would have been obvious. Instead, conversations softened, shortened, redirected, enough to acknowledge me, not enough to involve me. It was subtle, almost respectful, and that's what made it difficult to question. Because how do you confront something that doesn't look intentional? How do you challenge a change that arrives without confrontation? I started paying attention to timing, when decisions were mentioned, when plans were referenced, when conclusions were already formed. I was always a step behind, not uninformed, just uninvited. I realized that conversations were no longer places where ideas were shaped. They had become places where outcomes were announced, and I was no longer part of the shaping. I remembered a time when my thoughts were sought before decisions took form, when my perspective added balance, when my silence was noticed. Now, silence blended in. I watched how others spoke freely with one another, how their exchanges flowed easily, uninterrupted by consideration of my input. They weren't excluding me out of malice, they were simply continuing without adjustment. And that's when it became clear. My role had changed without discussion. I hadn't been removed, I had been repositioned, from participant to observer. That shift carries a strange emotional weight, not heavy enough to hurt, but noticeable enough to matter. I began choosing my seat differently, standing near the edge of rooms, listening more than speaking, not because I felt small, but because the space had quietly redefined itself. When I did speak, my words landed politely and passed quickly, a nod, a brief acknowledgement, then the conversation moved on. I didn't feel dismissed. I felt completed, like my contribution was no longer required. And understanding that truth demanded honesty, not emotion. There's a moment when you realize that speaking more won't bring you closer. It will only highlight the distance. So I stopped trying to keep pace. I stopped interrupting silence. I stopped filling gaps that weren't meant for me anymore. And in doing so, I learned something unexpected. Stepping back doesn't always mean falling behind. Sometimes it means seeing clearly. Once I noticed the shift, I couldn't unsee it. Conversations had found new paths that no longer curved around my presence. They moved efficiently now, without pausing to gather my thoughts or check my comfort. And yet, nothing felt hostile. That's the part people misunderstand. They imagine exclusion as sharp, obvious, painful. But most of the time, it's gentle, wrapped in normalcy, hidden inside routine. I realized that no one wakes up deciding to push someone out. They simply stop pulling them in. That difference matters. I asked myself whether I wanted to change it, whether reclaiming space would restore something meaningful or simply disturb a new balance that had already settled. The answer surprised me. I didn't feel the urge to reclaim anything, not because I lacked courage, but because I respected clarity. I had spent years believing that being included was proof of value, that participation equaled importance, that being heard was the same as being needed. But watching conversations happen without me taught me something quieter and more durable. Value doesn't disappear when attention does. I started listening differently, not for cues to enter, but for understanding. I heard how decisions were framed, how priorities were revealed, how easily people adapt when roles shift. And I learned that my absence didn't create chaos. It created efficiency. That realization could have stung. Instead, it grounded me, because it freed me from responsibility I had been carrying alone. I no longer felt compelled to manage outcomes, to anticipate reactions, to soften edges before they appeared. That work had been reassigned, and I let it go. The more I accepted the shift, the lighter I felt. Conversations no longer drained me. I wasn't calculating when to speak or how to be heard. I existed without performance, and in that space I found something rare. Peace without validation. I realized that the discomfort I once felt wasn't about being excluded. It was about resisting a truth that had already settled. Once I stopped resisting, everything softened. I still listened, I still cared, but I no longer waited. I wasn't silent because I had nothing to say. I was silent because I understood what silence was telling me. Conversations hadn't shifted because I failed. They had shifted because life moved, and I moved with it, just in a different direction. Not behind, not below, beside, but no longer attached. And in that quiet acceptance, I discovered a version of myself that didn't need to be invited to feel complete. The first time I heard about a decision after it had already been made, it arrived casually, almost kindly. Someone mentioned it in passing, as if it were a small detail I must have already known. The tone was light, unbothered, confident. There was no pause for my reaction. I nodded instinctively, not because I agreed, but because surprise had learned how to hide itself on my face. That moment didn't feel like betrayal. Betrayal is loud. This was quiet, procedural, efficient. It felt like being informed rather than involved, like reading the summary of a meeting you hadn't been invited to. I realized then that timing carries meaning. When you're told before a decision, your voice matters. When you're told after, your understanding is expected, not your input. I replayed the conversation later, not to analyze words, but to notice what wasn't there. No explanation of how the choice was reached, no curiosity about my thoughts, no space left open for reconsideration. The decision had already settled. It didn't feel personal. That's what made it unsettling. If someone excludes you out of emotion, there's conflict. There's something to respond to. But when exclusion feels administrative, you're forced to accept that your role has quietly changed. I thought about how often I used to be part of the before plans were finalized, before directions were set, before conclusions became facts. Now I existed in the after decisions, after discussions, after certainty. And the more it happened, the more it began to feel natural. Not because it was right, but because repetition creates normalcy. I noticed how my questions changed. Instead of, "What should we do?" I asked, "So this is what's happening." Instead of offering ideas, I adjusted to outcomes. That shift didn't come with resistance, it came with observation. I watched how smoothly things moved without waiting for me, how quickly clarity formed when fewer voices were involved, how decisiveness replaced discussion. Efficiency has its own appeal, and in that efficiency, I saw something honest, not about them, but about me. I had been carrying weight no one realized they had already set down. When I stopped being part of decisions, I also stopped being responsible for their consequences. That realization didn't make me careless, it made me lighter. I listened as future plans were mentioned, places I wouldn't be, choices I wouldn't influence, paths that didn't require my agreement. I felt strangely calm, not excluded, released. Because when people stop consulting you, they also stop expecting you to fix what follows. I began to understand that being informed later wasn't an accident, it was a signal. And signals, when recognized, remove confusion. I wasn't being overlooked, I was being transitioned from contributor to witness. And once I named it honestly, it stopped hurting. Hearing decisions after they were made taught me how much I had equated involvement with worth. For years, my value felt tied to how early I was included, how much influence I had, how often my approval was sought. But once those moments disappeared, I had to confront a quieter truth. I had been measuring myself by access. And access, I learned, is not the same as importance. When people stopped asking me beforehand, I initially wondered what I had done wrong. Had I become difficult, less relevant, easier to bypass? Those questions lingered briefly, then faded, because clarity has a way of dissolving self-doubt when you stop personalizing change. I started noticing patterns instead of assigning blame. I saw how decisions were streamlined, how fewer voices meant faster outcomes, how complexity was avoided. This wasn't about silencing me, it was about simplifying the process. Understanding that removed emotion from the equation. I began listening with different ears, not as someone waiting to be heard, but as someone evaluating truth. I noticed which decisions were thoughtful and which were rushed, which were considerate and which were convenient. And I realized something unexpected. Not being consulted gave me perspective. I could see the full picture without being emotionally invested in shaping it. I could recognize when choices aligned with my values and when they didn't, without needing to intervene. That distance became informative. I stopped reacting, I stopped correcting, I stopped carrying the urge to improve outcomes that no longer belonged to me. And in that space, I learned restraint, not the forced kind, but the chosen kind. Restraint that says, this isn't mine to manage anymore. That realization didn't shrink me, it clarified me. I didn't withdraw from care, I withdrew from control. There's a difference. Caring keeps your heart open. Control keeps your hands busy. I let my hands rest. When new decisions were shared with me after the fact, I listened calmly. I acknowledged them without resistance. I adapted without resentment. Because by then, I understood the unspoken agreement. They had chosen direction, I had chosen peace. And peace, I discovered, doesn't come from being included in everything. It comes from knowing where you truly belong. I belonged to myself again, not to every outcome, not to every choice, not to every conversation. Hearing decisions later wasn't a loss, it was a boundary being drawn, quietly, firmly, without confrontation. And for the first time, I respected it.
There was a time when my questions were expected. They were part of the process, a pause that helped others think more clearly, a moment where assumptions were tested and plans became stronger. I didn't ask to challenge anyone. I asked because clarity mattered to me. Slowly, that expectation faded. At first, my questions were answered quickly, almost automatically. Short responses, polite confirmations. Nothing wrong on the surface, but the depth was gone. The conversation didn't open anymore. It closed faster. I noticed how people exchanged glances before responding, how answers came with finality rather than curiosity. My questions no longer invited discussion, they marked an ending. That's when I understood something subtle had changed. Questions only matter when people are still deciding. Once decisions are settled, questions become interruptions. I started sensing that before words were spoken. The tone shifted, the patience shortened. Not irritation, just efficiency. We've already handled that. It's taken care of. That won't be necessary. Each phrase was calm, reasonable, complete, and with each one, my role shrank a little more. I asked fewer questions after that, not because I lacked interest, but because I respected the signal being sent. When people stop needing your questions, they've already decided where you stand. I observed how conversations moved faster without me slowing them down, how certainty replaced reflection, how outcomes were prioritized over understanding, and I realized my questions had once represented care. Now they represented delay. That realization wasn't painful, it was sobering. I had to admit that part of my identity was tied to being the one who thought things through, who noticed gaps, who asked what if and are we sure. But when those questions stopped being welcome, I had a choice. I could insist, or I could listen. I chose to listen. Listening showed me something I hadn't wanted to see before. My questions weren't needed because my perspective was no longer essential to the direction being taken. That truth didn't insult me, it clarified the path others had chosen. I watched how my silence changed the room. There was relief in it. Conversations flowed without pause, decisions landed faster, and I understood then that my absence, even in questioning, had become convenient. Convenience isn't cruel, it's efficient, and efficiency rarely asks permission. I felt myself step back emotionally, not out of hurt, but out of alignment. When you realize your contributions are no longer required, forcing them only creates friction. So I stopped asking. And in that stopping, I learned something unexpected. Questions aren't powerful because they're spoken, they're powerful because they're invited. When my questions became unnecessary, I gained something I hadn't expected: clarity without responsibility. I no longer felt the need to anticipate outcomes or prepare explanations. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I didn't feel tension about what needed to be said. Silence simplified things. Without questions, I became an observer of patterns rather than a participant in processes. I noticed how certainty was often mistaken for confidence, how speed replaced thoughtfulness, how agreement came easier when fewer voices were involved. And I realized something important.
Not every decision improves when it's questioned, but every question reveals who values reflection. My silence revealed that reflection was no longer the priority. That understanding didn't make me cynical, it made me selective. I began choosing carefully when to speak, not because I was afraid, but because I understood timing. Speaking into closed spaces doesn't open them, it only echoes back. I saved my voice for places where it mattered. That choice brought peace. I didn't feel ignored, I felt redirected. There's dignity in recognizing when your role has concluded. Not everything ends in conflict, some things end in quiet recognition. I started asking different questions, privately, internally. Questions about myself, about what I wanted to carry forward, about where my energy truly belonged. Those questions mattered more. I realized I had been giving my insight to spaces that no longer valued it, while neglecting spaces within myself that needed attention. So I turned inward. Without the pressure to contribute, I found clarity. Without the expectation to guide others, I learned how to guide myself. I stopped measuring my worth by how often I was consulted. I stopped equating relevance with involvement, and in doing so, I reclaimed something essential. My voice didn't disappear, it matured. It learned restraint. It learned intention. Now, when I speak, it's deliberate. When I stay silent, it's chosen. Questions didn't become unnecessary because they lacked value. They became unnecessary because the direction had already been chosen. And once I accepted that, I stopped trying to reopen doors that were quietly closing. I turned instead toward spaces where openness still existed, even if those spaces were within me. And that shift, more than any answer I had ever received, brought me peace. The moment I stopped explaining myself didn't arrive with certainty or relief. It arrived with exhaustion, the quiet kind that settles in after you realize how much energy you've been spending just to be understood. For a long time, I believed explanations were bridges, that if I spoke carefully enough, kindly enough, clearly enough, people would meet me halfway. I thought understanding was something you could earn through patience and effort, so I explained. I explained my intentions. I explained my concerns. I explained my silences. I explained even when no one asked, filling spaces with context, softening edges, making myself easier to accept. At first, it felt necessary, helpful even. Explanations kept things smooth. They prevented misunderstandings. They made interactions comfortable. But comfort has a cost when it's one-sided. I started noticing how explanations were received, not questioned, not explored, simply acknowledged, and then set aside. People nodded, they smiled, they moved on. Nothing changed. I realized then that explanations only matter when someone is willing to listen with openness. Without that willingness, words become background noise, polite but ineffective. The moment came quietly. Someone misunderstood my choice and reacted with certainty, not curiosity. They didn't ask why, they assumed. I felt the familiar urge rise, to clarify, to correct, to defend. My mouth opened instinctively, and then it closed. Not because I had nothing to say, because I recognized the pattern. I knew how the conversation would go. I would explain, they would listen briefly, the conclusion would remain the same. So I stayed silent. That silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. For the first time, I chose not to translate myself for someone who wasn't trying to understand. The room didn't fall apart, no crisis followed. Life continued as it always had. And that taught me something essential. Explanations weren't holding things together, they were holding me in place. By explaining constantly, I was trying to maintain a version of myself that fit comfortably into others' expectations, even when those expectations had already shifted. I realized that explaining had become a form of self-negotiation, a way of justifying my presence, my choices, my boundaries, and I was tired. Not angry, not hurt, just finished. I felt a strange calm replace the urge to defend, a steadiness I hadn't felt before, as if something unnecessary had been set down. I watched how the absence of explanation changed the dynamic. Some people filled the silence with assumptions, others grew uncomfortable, a few simply moved on. None of those reactions required my intervention. I understood then that explanations don't guarantee understanding, they only reveal where understanding is possible. And in that moment, I stopped explaining myself to spaces that had already closed. After I stopped explaining myself, I became more aware of my energy, how it moved, where it went, and how easily it could be drained when misused. I noticed how much time explanations had consumed, time spent choosing words carefully, time spent rehearsing conversations, time spent anticipating misinterpretations before they happened. All of that time came back to me. Without explanations, my days felt quieter, not empty, intentional. I wasn't constantly preparing for conversations that never led anywhere. I learned that not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Some misunderstandings are reflections of fixed perspectives, not gaps in communication, and I wasn't responsible for fixing those. This didn't mean I stopped communicating altogether. It meant I became selective. I explained myself where it mattered, where curiosity existed, where listening was mutual. Everywhere else, I let my actions speak. Actions are slower than explanations, but they're harder to ignore. I noticed how people reacted differently when I stopped clarifying. Some grew distant, others adjusted. A few respected the boundary without comment. Those reactions told me everything I needed to know. When you stop explaining yourself, you remove the safety net others rely on to misunderstand you comfortably, and that discomfort belongs to them, not you. I realized that explanations had once made me feel safe. They were a shield against judgment, a way of controlling perception. But control is heavy, and safety built on constant justification is fragile. By letting go of explanations, I accepted uncertainty. I accepted that people would think what they wanted. I accepted that clarity wouldn't always be mutual. And in that acceptance, I felt lighter. I wasn't guarding my narrative anymore. I was living it. There's a quiet confidence that comes when you stop needing approval to feel settled, when your sense of self no longer depends on being correctly interpreted by everyone around you. I felt that confidence grow slowly, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. I no longer rushed to clarify silence. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I no longer felt obligated to smooth over discomfort. I trusted myself enough to let my truth exist without explanation, and that trust changed everything. The moment I stopped explaining myself wasn't an ending, it was a shift from proving to being, from defending to standing, from noise to clarity. I didn't lose my voice. I simply stopped spending it where it wasn't valued. Watching decisions happen without me felt strange at first, not because I wanted control, but because I was so used to being part of the process. For years, involvement had been normal. Conversations flowed through me. Outcomes carried my fingerprints even when they weren't mine alone. Now, decisions moved past me like quiet weather, noticeable but no longer directed at me. I would hear about them indirectly, a comment made in passing, a change already implemented, a plan unfolding as if it had always existed this way. No one announced anything formally. There were no declarations, no acknowledgments of shift. Life simply adjusted, and I was expected to adjust with it. I noticed how quickly things moved once my presence was no longer a factor. Meetings were shorter, conversations more decisive, fewer pauses, fewer doubts. Efficiency has a rhythm, and I could hear it clearly now. At first, I tried to stay emotionally neutral. I told myself this was natural, that roles evolve, that involvement changes over time. All of that was true, but neutrality doesn't erase awareness. I saw how people spoke with confidence about outcomes I hadn't helped shape, how they defended choices with certainty, how they referred to what we decided without hesitation. I wasn't part of the we anymore. And strangely, that realization didn't hurt as much as I expected, because I also noticed something else. No one asked me to carry the consequences. When decisions worked, they took pride. When they didn't, they handled the fallout among themselves. My absence wasn't just from the decision-making, it was from the responsibility. That separation felt clean. I began observing more carefully, not to judge, but to understand. I watched how priorities were set, which values were emphasized, which compromises were accepted. And I realized the direction being taken no longer aligned fully with how I would have chosen. That awareness brought relief. I didn't have to reconcile my values with outcomes I didn't support. I didn't have to justify decisions that felt misaligned. I could remain honest without being oppositional. Watching from the outside gave me perspective. I could see how certainty often replaced collaboration, how speed replaced consideration, how agreement was sometimes confused with consensus. But none of that required my intervention. I wasn't responsible for steering anymore. There's a quiet freedom in that. I stopped mentally editing conversations, stopped imagining alternative paths, stopped thinking about how I would have done things differently. Because how I would have done them no longer mattered in that space. And accepting that wasn't defeat, it was clarity. I was no longer shaping the direction, I was witnessing it. And witnesses don't interrupt, they observe. As time passed, watching decisions happen without me became less noticeable, not because it stopped happening, but because I stopped resisting it. Resistance creates friction. Acceptance creates flow. I realized that my discomfort hadn't come from exclusion itself, it had come from attachment to a role that had already evolved. Once I released that attachment, everything softened. I noticed how calm I felt when outcomes were shared with me after the fact. I no longer felt the urge to evaluate or correct. I listened, acknowledged, and moved on. There was no bitterness in that response, only recognition. Recognition that my energy belonged elsewhere now. I began using that energy differently, focusing inward, attending to spaces I had neglected while managing everyone else's concerns. I paid attention to my own pace, my own thoughts, my own boundaries. Watching decisions unfold without my input taught me something powerful. I had been confusing involvement with belonging. Belonging doesn't require constant participation, it requires alignment. And my alignment had shifted. I still cared about outcomes, but I no longer needed to shape them to feel relevant. I trusted others to handle what they had chosen. That trust wasn't blind, it was intentional. I accepted that people make choices based on their priorities, and those priorities don't always include every voice. Understanding that allowed me to step back without resentment. I also learned something about silence. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means presence without interference. I was present, aware, attentive, grounded, without being involved. That kind of presence feels different. It's lighter, less demanding. I noticed how my reactions changed. I no longer rehearsed conversations in advance. I no longer anticipated conflict. I no longer prepared arguments that would never be needed. My mind felt clearer. Watching decisions happen without me didn't reduce my value, it refined it.
I stopped proving my worth through contribution. I stopped measuring myself by how often my opinion was sought. Instead, I measured myself by how peacefully I could exist within change. And I did that well. There's strength in knowing when to lead and when to step aside, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. I stepped aside not because I was pushed, but because I understood the moment. And in that understanding, I found stability. I wasn't lost in the process. I was simply no longer centered in it. And that, I learned, was okay.
Being polite had always come naturally to me. It wasn't something I practiced deliberately, it was simply how I moved through the world. I listened fully, I waited my turn, I chose words carefully so no one would feel uncomfortable. For a long time, politeness felt like respect. But there came a moment when I realized it had quietly turned into something else. In conversations, I noticed how my pauses stretched longer than necessary, how my sentences were gently spoken and gently passed over. I would begin a thought, only to have it redirected, reshaped, or completed by someone else, and I would let it happen. Not because I agreed, not because I lacked clarity, but because I didn't want to interrupt the flow. Politeness became my habit. Silence became my contribution. At first, I told myself this was maturity, that not every thought needs airtime, that harmony matters more than being heard. Those things are true, to a point, but I began to feel the quiet weight of it, the subtle pressure of holding back again and again, the emotional effort of being agreeable when my perspective remained unacknowledged. I realized that politeness, when it's one-sided, becomes a burden. I watched how louder voices moved easily through conversations, how interruptions were accepted as enthusiasm, how certainty was rewarded more than consideration. Meanwhile, my restraint blended into the background. No one dismissed me openly. There was no rudeness, no obvious exclusion. That's what made it heavier. Being ignored politely doesn't give you something to respond to. There's nothing to confront, nothing to correct, just absence. I noticed how often decisions were finalized while I was still choosing my words, how outcomes solidified before my thoughts reached the surface, and each time I smiled and nodded, not because I approved, but because I didn't want to disrupt the moment. That smile became a reflex. I started to feel tired in ways that rest didn't fix, because the exhaustion wasn't physical, it was emotional. It came from constantly adjusting myself to fit the room, from shrinking my presence to keep things comfortable for others. I wondered when politeness had started costing me visibility, and more importantly, why I had allowed it. I wasn't afraid to speak. I was afraid of being seen as difficult, afraid of creating tension, afraid of being misunderstood. So I chose ease over expression. But ease came with a price. The more polite I became, the easier it was for others to overlook me, not intentionally, but naturally. Silence doesn't demand attention. And slowly, I began to understand that my politeness had trained people how to treat me. Once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The weight of being polite and ignored wasn't something others placed on me, it was something I carried willingly. That realization didn't bring anger, it brought responsibility. I started paying attention to how often I minimized myself to preserve comfort, how quickly I softened my opinions, how often I reframed my thoughts so they would land gently, even if that meant they landed nowhere at all. Politeness had become my armor, but armor is heavy when you wear it all the time. I asked myself a difficult question. Was I being kind, or was I avoiding discomfort? The answer wasn't simple, it was both. Kindness had slowly merged with self-erasure, and that wasn't sustainable. I didn't suddenly become louder or sharper. I didn't start interrupting or demanding space. Change doesn't always look dramatic. Instead, I began choosing when politeness was appropriate and when presence mattered more. Sometimes I finished my sentence even when someone tried to move past it. Sometimes I allowed a pause to exist without filling it with agreement. Sometimes I let my words stand, unsoftened. It felt unfamiliar at first. My voice sounded different to my own ears, firmer, clearer, and interestingly, nothing terrible happened. The world didn't collapse, the room didn't turn hostile, the tension I had feared never fully arrived. What did arrive was recognition, not always agreement, but acknowledgement. I learned that politeness doesn't have to mean invisibility, that respect includes respecting myself. And I also learned something deeper. Being ignored wasn't the worst outcome. Losing myself quietly was. Once I shifted that perspective, the weight lifted. I didn't abandon politeness, I reclaimed it. I used it intentionally, not defensively. I stopped apologizing for taking space, stopped explaining my right to speak. And when I was ignored despite that, I didn't internalize it, because I knew I had shown up honestly. The heaviness I once carried dissolved into something steadier, self-respect. I didn't need to be loud to be present. I didn't need to dominate to be heard. I only needed to stop disappearing. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, and firm, changed everything. For a long time, I believed defending myself was necessary. Not because I was being attacked openly, but because I felt misunderstood. I wanted clarity. I wanted fairness. I wanted people to see my intentions, not just the outcomes they assumed. So I explained. I explained my choices, my silence, my reactions, even my restraint. I filled in gaps that no one asked me to fill. I offered context before anyone requested it. I softened truths so they would sound acceptable. Defense became my reflex. Every conversation felt like a small courtroom, not hostile, just quietly evaluative. I was always presenting my case, hoping that if I said things clearly enough, carefully enough, I would finally be understood. But something strange began to happen. The more I explained, the less it seemed to matter. My words didn't change perceptions, they only prolonged discussions. They invited more interpretation, more judgment, more opinions. Defending myself didn't bring peace. It kept me engaged in cycles that drained me. I realized that my need to defend wasn't about others demanding answers, it was about me seeking validation. I wanted reassurance that I wasn't wrong for feeling the way I did, that my boundaries were reasonable, that my silence wasn't indifference. But validation is fragile when it comes from outside. One day, I noticed how tired I felt before even entering a conversation, how my body braced itself, anticipating the need to justify my presence, my pace, my distance. That's when it became clear. I was defending myself against assumptions I couldn't control, and in doing so, I was handing my peace over to people who hadn't asked for it and didn't always value it. There was a moment, quiet, ordinary, when I chose differently. Someone questioned a choice I had made, not aggressively, just casually, as if explanation was expected, and I didn't give one. I paused. I smiled gently, and I let the moment pass. It felt uncomfortable. My instinct screamed to clarify, to smooth things over. But I stayed still. The conversation moved on. Nothing terrible happened. That was the moment. The moment I realized I didn't owe explanations for living in alignment with myself. Defending myself had become a habit, not a necessity, and habits can be unlearned.
After I stopped defending myself, everything felt quieter. Not externally, but inside. There was space where attention used to live.
I noticed how often conversations no longer required my participation, how many opinions weren't actually directed at me, even when they involved me. I had been inserting myself unnecessarily, mistaking silence for obligation. Without defense, I listened differently. I heard what was being said and what wasn't. Some comments were just noise. Some questions weren't invitations, they were probes. Some misunderstandings didn't need correction. I stopped taking responsibility for other people's interpretations. That shift changed my posture, physically and emotionally. I stood differently. I breathed more deeply. I responded more slowly. Not out of fear, but out of certainty. Certainty that I didn't need approval to be grounded. I also noticed who adjusted when I stopped explaining. Some people leaned in with curiosity, others lost interest. Both reactions were informative. The ones who valued understanding approached me with respect. The ones who preferred control moved on when they realized they couldn't access my justifications. That distinction was clarifying. I wasn't becoming distant, I was becoming selective. Defending myself had kept me accessible in ways that didn't serve me. Removing that layer protected my energy. I still spoke when it mattered. I still clarified when confusion affected outcomes. But I no longer defended my feelings. Feelings don't require defense. They require acknowledgement from within. I learned that not every narrative needs my participation. Not every story told about me needs my correction. Some things are truer when left untouched. The moment I stopped defending myself wasn't about withdrawal. It was about trust. Trusting myself to stand without explanation. Trusting silence to do its work. Trusting that those who truly cared would meet me without needing proof. And they did. That moment marked a turning point, not because I became stronger overnight, but because I stopped wasting strength where it wasn't needed. I didn't lose my voice. I simply stopped using it to justify my existence.
There was a moment when I finally saw it. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly. Their calm faces. Not angry, not defensive, not conflicted, just calm. For a long time, I had mistaken calmness for peace. I assumed that if people looked relaxed, then nothing was wrong. That if no one raised their voice, then no harm was being done. But calm can hide certainty, and certainty doesn't always include compassion. I noticed it during ordinary moments, conversations that flowed easily, smiles that came on time, responses that were polite, measured, and final. There was no tension in the room, and yet something was missing. Me. I watched how decisions were discussed with confidence, how outcomes were shared as settled facts. No hesitation, no checking in, no glance in my direction. Their calmness wasn't reassurance, it was resolution. They had already made peace with choices I was still absorbing, and that realization shifted everything. I stopped searching their expressions for concern. I stopped waiting for a pause where my voice might fit, because there was none. They weren't calm because they were open, they were calm because they were done. That truth didn't hurt the way betrayal does. It didn't sting sharply. It settled slowly. I saw how comfort often comes from closure, even when that closure excludes someone. How people can be gentle while still being decisive. There was no cruelty in their calm faces, just clarity. And clarity, when it arrives without you, feels like distance. I understood then that I hadn't been overlooked accidentally. I had been considered and then placed aside. Not with malice, with acceptance. That understanding brought an unexpected sense of steadiness, because confusion hurts more than certainty. Once I saw the truth, I no longer wondered where I stood. I stood outside the circle of decision, and they were okay with that. Seeing that allowed me to stop guessing, stop interpreting tone, stop reading between lines that were already complete.
Their calm faces told me everything words never had.
After that realization, I began to see calm differently, not as safety but as information. Calm tells you where people are settled, where they no longer feel the need to negotiate or explain. And once I understood that, I stopped trying to disturb it. I didn't confront them. I didn't demand space in conversations already concluded, because I finally respected myself enough to not ask for entry where none was being offered. Their calm faces weren't an invitation. They were a boundary. And boundaries, even unspoken ones, deserve recognition. I also noticed something else. My own face had changed. I was calmer too, not because I agreed but because I accepted. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. It means alignment with reality. I no longer felt the urge to mirror their expressions or match their energy. I didn't need to prove that I was okay with it. I simply was. Seeing the truth in their calm faces freed me from expectation. I stopped expecting reconsideration, stopped hoping for inclusion that no longer fit the structure. And in that release, I gained something deeper. Self-direction. I redirected my attention away from what they had settled, and toward what I hadn't. My own choices, my own pace, my own next steps. I learned that when people are calm about excluding you, the most powerful response is not reaction, it's redirection. I didn't need to change their minds. I needed to change my focus. Their calmness showed me that the chapter had ended. So I turned the page. Not dramatically, not bitterly, quietly, with dignity. Seeing the truth didn't harden me, clarified me. I stopped asking questions that no longer had relevance. I stopped engaging with dynamics that no longer included me. And I stepped into a calmer space of my own, one that didn't depend on anyone else's expression. Their calm faces told the truth. And once I listened, I finally felt free. For a long time, I didn't realize how much of my energy was spent seeking approval. Not openly, not desperately, but quietly, consistently. In the way I adjusted my tone, softened my boundaries, and delayed my truth. Approval had felt like safety. If people were comfortable, then things were okay. If no one objected, then I must be doing the right thing. That belief had guided many of my choices without me questioning it. But something shifted. When I was no longer included, no longer consulted, no longer central, approval lost its power. There was nothing left to earn. And in that absence, I saw how much I had compromised myself trying to maintain harmony. I had mistaken acceptance for dignity. Dignity, I learned, doesn't depend on agreement. It depends on self-respect. Choosing dignity meant allowing discomfort, mine and theirs. It meant not reshaping myself to remain likable. Not explaining choices simply to ease someone else's uncertainty. It meant standing in my decisions even when they weren't applauded. That choice didn't feel bold. It felt quiet, grounded. I stopped checking reactions, stopped waiting for reassurance, stopped measuring my worth through others' responses. I noticed how often approval had delayed my growth, how it had kept me in places longer than necessary, how it had blurred my intuition. Letting go of approval clarified everything. I didn't become cold. I became honest. Honest about what I could give. Honest about what I would no longer carry. Choosing dignity didn't require confrontation. It required alignment. Alignment with my values, my limits, my truth. I didn't announce this shift. I embodied it. And people felt it. Some leaned away. Others adjusted. Both were acceptable. Because dignity isn't about control. It's about presence. And I was finally present with myself. Once I chose dignity over approval, my life didn't become easier, but it became lighter. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, no longer anticipated reactions, no longer edited myself before speaking. That mental freedom was transformative. I learned that approval asks you to shrink in exchange for peace. Dignity asks you to expand, even when peace isn't immediate. I chose expansion. I stopped agreeing just to keep things smooth. I stopped staying quiet just to remain included. And interestingly, I didn't lose what truly mattered. I lost what depended on my silence. People who valued me beyond convenience remained. Those who needed my compliance drifted. That separation wasn't painful. It was precise. Choosing dignity gave me clarity about where I belonged and where I didn't need to be anymore. I stopped negotiating my worth, stopped hoping to be chosen, because I had already chosen myself. That choice wasn't loud. It didn't require validation. It simply required consistency. I honored my boundaries even when no one was watching. I respected my time even when it inconvenienced others. I trusted my inner voice, not because it was always comfortable, but because it was always honest. Approval fades quickly. Dignity stays. It shows up in how you walk away without bitterness, how you remain kind without self-betrayal, how you accept endings without needing to explain them. I didn't win anyone over. I won myself back. And that was enough. Choosing dignity over approval wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of living it on my own terms,